So, I'm in Australia, in a pretty small country town, specifically in the quieter part of town. I've been seeing these things for only the past few years, about when I was 18 till now, so 21, outside of my neighbor's roof, which is clearly visible from my bedroom window, or the shed in my backyard. Also, from my bedroom windows, I will see what has been described as a crawler. Yet the ones I see are thin with a straight back. When slinking across the roof, their hands twice as long as normal, anatomically correct hands that sprawl out wide. I haven't seen any distinct facial features, but what stands out is that instead of being white or silvery in color, they're pitch black, darker than the night sky. They move slowly and fluidly, close to the roof without a hunch or any excess movements as a human crawling would, as if its legs bend sideways. I often see them and avoid looking at them directly, but I have never seen them touch the ground or get any closer than my neighbor's roof.
Like most other people, I have my ups and downs in life. I wouldn't say life is bad, but I have had my share of problems and rough spots. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a depressed person, and don't recall ever having serious suicidal thoughts, but just like anyone else, I've had rough moments in my life where all I wanted was someone to talk to and listen. After recovering from a rough patch where I lost a beloved family member, a childhood friend, and the job I loved, I decided to give back to the people who may be going through rough patches themselves, and started volunteering at a distress center, also called a suicide hotline. I'm not sure how it is in the rest of the world, but where I am at, it is basically a cell center. You sit around waiting for calls, and you are an ear for these people to listen to their problems, and you do what you can to talk them through their problems, and out of doing something they may regret. It is a tough job, I'll admit. You get a wide range of problems, from petty teenagers thinking their life is going to end because their high school sweetheart doesn't love them back, all the way to physically abusive relationships, addicts who just want out, schizophrenics with voices telling them to kill themselves, coping with sudden loss of family members or other loved ones. As hard as it was for me at times, I strongly believe those people really needed me, so quitting was not an option. I could go on and on into details about the most depressing stories I heard, but those are stories for another day. One of the misconceptions of these hotlines is one would think they would get a lot of bawling people threatening to kill themselves at that very moment. The reality is, a lot of these people call in just to talk, and if you were to go by the tone of their voice, you would think these people are perfectly fine, and perhaps just venting their problems, like you would when catching up with an old friend. During my training, I was told that the calmer people, in many cases, the ones we should worry about the most. A few months into my volunteer job, I would receive a call from a girl named Sarah. It was one of those cases that she just wanted to have someone to chat with. Her story was not nearly as tragic as some of the cases I had dealt with before, but she was quite lonely, far away from her hometown, just had no idea where she was going with her life. She had dropped out of university with some nasty debt and didn't know what to do with herself. As someone in my early 20s, also a university dropout, and away from their hometown, I could relate. We had a decent and uneventful conversation, which at the time I hoped helped brighten her day a bit. Unfortunately, this was interrupted by my supervisor tapping me on the shoulder and asking if I was okay. I told him yes, of course. I was having a decent day. The conversation was also going fine. He looked concerned. but walked away without saying much else. Whenever I tried to get back to my conversation with Sarah, the headset was mute. This was quite upsetting, but unfortunately, it was expected to happen every now and then, since the center's equipment was not the best. I requested a new headset from my supervisor, but unfortunately, there were none available at the given time. I messed around with it a bit and somehow got it working again. I was able to continue my shift, and can only hope the girl was okay. About a week or so went by, relatively uneventful, until suddenly that same girl, Sarah, called again, conveniently during my shift. There are quite a few of us working at this particular center, so it is somewhat unlikely to get a call from the same person more than once in such a short span of time. Once I realized it was her, I apologized for the inconvenience of the call suddenly ending. She seemed to understand. The conversation moved on, and it was nice. I know what you're thinking. How could you describe a call received while volunteering at a distress center? Nice. I don't really know how to explain it. It did not feel like a stranger calling to talk because they need an ear to listen to, or to vent, or fear they will hurt themselves. It felt like I was catching up with an old friend I hadn't spoke to in a while. At the time, it felt like we had the kind of personalities that just clicked. We had some other things in common, such as our love for video games, dogs, guinea pigs, hatred for cabbage, and we both seemed to be awful with relationships. The conversation lasted a while until she had to leave to run some errands. She thanked me for my time and said she felt much better. This made me happy. This was the reason I chose to volunteer for this job to begin with. A couple of days later she called again, right when my shift started again. This is especially odd in such a short span of time. The likelihood of getting 3 calls from the same person in the span of about a week is very low. And it was even weirder that she was the first one to do the call. I shrugged it off, and in a weird way, was pleased to hear from her again. This time she said she was upset. She said she was very lonely. Just had a guy who she was interested in completely ignore her and had zero support from her family during her rough times. She said all she had to talk to was me at the distress center. I talked her through it. She seemed a bit calmer by the end of it. She mentioned that I was the only person she could talk to, and also mentioned how odd it was that we seemed to just click as if we were best friends, even though this was only the 3rd time we had spoken. Suddenly, midway through conversation, the damn headset went mute again, and the call crashed. I have to stress that this never happened with any other calls, only with Sarah. Shortly after, I began another call with a teenage boy who was going through some family troubles. A couple of minutes into the conversation, and it was interrupted by an incoming call by Sarah. This is not normal to happen. The way our systems work is a call queue is placed and randomly assigns agents in the center who will answer the call whenever they become available. There was probably some weird bug, and it just so happened to be Sarah calling. Who knows really? Unfortunately, our system isn't the best quality software. This time around, she complained that it seems the phones keep crashing on us, and she fears I will leave her too. This gave me a weird feeling, but as usual, I shrugged it off and continued our conversation, hoping there were no more system crashes. I also plan to talk to one of the managers soon about how my headset and system seem to be acting up lately. After that day, my following 3 shifts, Sarah called, and we just talked. Our conversations started spanning longer and longer times. We would talk about everything you can imagine. For the most of it, she seemed pretty well, which on one hand kind of worried me. This was a distress center after all, During the third day in a row which she called, the conversation was suddenly interrupted by my manager, who did not seem happy. He told me to put down the set immediately and come to his office. When I tried to explain I was in the middle of the call, he just replied with something along the lines of, "This is very important," almost like a principal of a school with a problem student. I quickly said my goodbyes to Sarah and told her to try calling again, and another agent would be available to talk to her. She seemed to be upset for a moment and started making me promise I wouldn't leave her like everyone else has. I did not know what to say to that, so I just agreed and went with my manager to his office. Without sugarcoating it, the man essentially said they were going to let me go. He said unfortunately this job is not for everyone, and he did not believe it was right for me. I was let go from my volunteer job under the accusation that it simply was not for me. I asked him what on earth was he talking about. I took every single call immediately and handled them very well. Whenever I was stressed over the job, he sure as hell would have never known. He said he knew I did a fine job whenever I was on the phones, but I was slowly losing my pace and holding up the queue. I asked him what on earth he was talking about after all. I am on those damn phones from the moment I step in until it is time to leave. He showed me my call records, which did in fact have a bunch of points where I was not on call. He also went on to mention that the other people who use the same station I do have never experienced any problems I have been complaining about for the last couple of weeks. I said I did not recall that and can assure him I was always on the phone when I had to be. Unfortunately, it was all in vain. He let me go and didn't really want to hear me. He gave me my termination details and some contact information in case I ever feel I have any mental problems. I find it quite ironic that the manager of a distress center won't even listen to his own volunteers. I left in a bit of a shock and extremely confused. Whenever I got home, started crying like a baby. Once I calmed down, I started reflecting on the call logs shown to me. There were indeed a ton of holes in them, and upon thinking more about it, some if not most of them would have been the times I spoke to Sarah. I worried about her, although I do know she was in good hands with my former colleagues from the distress center. About another week went by. Life was mundane, but I was pulling through. I slowly stopped worrying so much about Sarah, the same way one slowly gets over missing a friend who they have lost. One night, I went to bed and everything was fine. However, I woke up to a sudden rod falling on my head. I wasn't in bed, but on the floor in front of my window. I've never been a sleepwalker, so just the fact I woke up out of my bed was weird enough. Startled, I became aware of my surroundings and realized my sheet was tied around my neck. The curtains were on the floor with the rod that had awoken me so abruptly. I took the sheet off my neck and realized the other end of the sheet was actually tied to the curtain rod. That is when it hit me. Did I just try to kill myself? Terrified, I ran through my apartment. There was no one there. Either someone tried to kill me, or I tried to kill myself. I don't remember. I still don't understand. I called my parents, who were slightly annoyed at a call from their bawling daughter in the middle of the night. They did not really understand me, told me to calm down, and if I did feel threatened in some way, shape, or form, to simply call the cops. They live in a different town from me, so there was only so much they could do. I don't know how, but I suppose I eventually fell asleep. That morning, when I woke up, my curtains were back up. Maybe it was all just a dream. My parents never called back to check on me. I suppose it is like them. They were somewhat oblivious and absent. A couple of days passed by, Things seemed to be returning to normal. One night, after going out and eating pizza with some work colleagues, I suddenly found myself in front of the toilet, completely naked. I have no idea how I got there. I hadn't been drinking or doing anything. I made the mistake of looking in the toilet, and there it was, my half-digested pepperoni pizza. I immediately freaked out. Had I gotten food poisoning by it? Once I flushed the toilet and tried to retrace my steps there, I found my toothbrush on the floor next to the toilet. Puzzled, I picked it up and realized its tip was covered in saliva and mucus. You know, as if someone has stuck it in the back of someone's throat to make them puke. I don't know how, but I just knew this was somehow related to the curtain incident a few days before. I went to my window and took a close look at where my curtain rod was. What I had not noticed for the last couple of days was that where the rod was being held was cracked. I gently pulled them down, and the whole thing fell. Essentially, my curtains had indeed fallen, but someone had haphazardly put them back up. I was terrified. Something was really wrong. I went to bed, absolutely terrified. The next morning I woke up with my arms covered in scratches. I don't mean any kind of scratches. I mean self-harm scratches. There was also a note with my handwriting which went on and on about how useless I am, about how much I hate myself, that I am ugly, I am fat, that I am stupid, irresponsible. No one will ever love me. You have to understand, as mentioned previously, I've had my problems and shortcomings in life, but never have I had actual suicidal thoughts, practiced self-harm, or any real serious form of depression. Terrified, I ran to my parents' house. Had to suddenly quit my job and leave my apartment behind for now. But some things, such as your own well-being, are just more important than any of that. I needed help. I needed support. Now back in my hometown, occasionally I would wake up with new self-harm wounds and notes about how much I hated myself. The conclusion to this is as obvious as you would expect. I am the one doing this to myself. I developed some form of multiple personality disorder. And was this the result? I began taking antidepressants. I don't mean to shit on the drug. I know it helps a lot of people through their problems, but with me it just made me feel like an emotionless zombie. Because of the damage I had been doing to myself, my dose was very high, but other than being terrified, I promise you, I was not depressed. However, now I was terrified. One night I woke up to myself vomiting my stomach out. I could not stop. My body was shaking. My heart was pounding. I felt awful pain in my muscles. I fell out of bed and on the floor found my antidepressants container, completely empty. Needless to say, I was rushed to the hospital and treated for the overdose. Once that was done, my parents were forced to take me to a mental clinic, which I gladly accepted. During my stay, I was told when to eat, sleep, shit, and always being carefully observed. There was also multiple sessions with a therapist every day in which they went through my entire life over and over again. The topic of when this all started was the main one. It was all whenever I suddenly got fired from the distress center. I went over all the calls I could remember, which of course included the ones with Sarah. The sudden interruptions whenever she called, and that I was fired under the claim that it simply wasn't right for me, and had not been on the phones at all times I was supposed to. All this despite that I knew for a fact I was on those phones at just about every moment I was there. The therapist went on to suggest that perhaps I wasn't, specifically if they fired me for it. The distress center needs people willing to volunteer there. They wouldn't just do massive layoffs all willy-nilly. I had already heard this before from the doctor that first diagnosed me. but I know what I heard. I know what I did. I was always on those phones, and there was something wrong with the system and my headset. It was frustrating. My parents managed to somehow get my call logs from the distress center. I can imagine they explained the situation, and perhaps got some documentation regarding my state since I left the center. This was all without my knowledge at the time. The call logs were brought up during a session. At this point, it had been a few weeks since leaving it, but the therapist told me to try to remember hard who I was speaking to during the times that there was nothing. This was a no-brainer. I remember from the day they let me go. It was Sarah. From what I could see, none of my calls with Sarah were registered. Add that to the fact that I was the only one who got them. This is going exactly where you think it is. The calls really never did happen. Sarah did not exist. Once this is established, this was the main theme of my therapy session. Sarah did not exist. I was Sarah. I was the one having those long conversations in my mind. Once I left the distress center, I was the one harming myself. Basically, what I am saying is, I was Sarah. It was a long week. Finally, I was let go from the clinic, but still going to therapy and under careful watch by my parents. I wasn't allowed around anything remotely harmful. I wasn't allowed to be alone, anything. Everything I did was carefully watched, and I was on some hardcore medication at this point. The next few days are quite hazy due to the medication I had been on. I hated it, and it just didn't feel right. Because there was always someone watching me, the self-harm and suicide attempts stopped completely. Unfortunately, this did not feel right. I know this may have been a terrible idea, but I stopped taking my medication. I would take the pills in front of my parents, as requested by them, but would soon, at my first opportunity, spit them out. Now off the medication, I could think clearly again. At that point, it didn't even matter anyway. I was constantly being watched. I was still uneasy with the idea that Sarah was nothing more than a figment of my disturbed mind. It was time to get to the bottom of this and prove to myself whether or not she really did exist. I gathered all the information I could remember about her: hometown, high school, university, hobbies, previous boyfriends' names, friends' names. We talked a lot in that short period of time, so luckily, I knew a lot about her. Unfortunately, I did not have her last name, and had to hope Sarah was not an alias. After a long iteration of keywords, going through pages of Google, social media, I finally found something. A simple web page named In Memory of Sarah. It has a picture of a girl in her early 20s sitting on a grass field in what looked like a beautiful sunny day. The page read, "Young, smart, beautiful Sarah, who unfortunately is no longer with us. Sarah struggled her entire life through depression, which unfortunately ultimately won the battle. She will be dearly missed by her parents, 2 brothers, grandparents, and many friends." The page had her whole biography. It went into detail about her long-term struggle with depression that just kept getting worse as she aged. The page urged people to donate to a charitable mental health service center and directed anybody having suicidal thoughts to the distress center I used to volunteer at, as well as a bunch of other mental health related services. I googled her name and found some of her social media accounts. Her Facebook account was still there, with the whole remembering banner at the top of it. The last picture I could see was a picture of her guinea pigs playing with a ball. The first comments were talking about how cute they were, followed by a bunch of people saying how much they missed her, and the usual "rest in peace." One of the comments was a man named Bill. He had a couple of different comments saying how much he missed her, and how he thinks of her every day. It just dawned on me. Bill was the name of the man she was claiming had been ignoring her. He hadn't. She was dead. This was the Sarah I spoke to. The thing that gets me in all of this is the fact that her last post was the day we first spoke. Did the call actually go through that day at all? If she was still alive when we spoke, would she still be if the call hadn't suddenly been cut off? These are questions I kept asking myself every day. I wish I could just wish her to rest in peace in her eternal slumber, but it seems as if she has never really gone to sleep. Through me somehow, she is still trying to end it all. And here we are now. I haven't done any self-harm since being constantly watched, but I believe this situation is far from over. I know that I can't live like this for the rest of my life, and feel for the girl who is clearly still suffering even after her death. The distress center, which was our only point of contact, won't take me back. Everyone thinks I'm crazy, and the girl I found online is just another victim of suicide that shares some similarities with the girl I think I spoke to. I know the girl I spoke to existed. I know she is Sarah. I know Sarah is dead. I know, as I am writing this, I seem okay. But the reality is, I am not okay. My life had completely fallen apart. Things are out of my control. I didn't know if I can keep this up. Whenever I found a window of privacy in my now heavily monitored life, I decided to finally make use of the wonderful service I once worked for. I called the distress center. A woman replied to me on the other end of the line. As I started talking, suddenly the call went mute. There was nothing but silence. I was 8 or 9 at the time. My mother had to move my sister, herself, and I to a shelter due to her abusive ex-boyfriend. I think my mother asked me to go get the laundry basket upstairs. I went upstairs and no one was up there except me. But as soon as I got upstairs, I had this weird sensation that I was being watched. I approached my mother's and her roommate's bedroom to retrieve the basket. As I walked back to approach the staircase, I felt a breeze, which was odd since the window in there couldn't open. I shivered in fear, knowing something strange was about to happen. This wasn't the first time I have felt an eerie presence. At this time, I haven't seen any strange phenomenon in quite some time. A little boy that sounded on the verge of tears called out, "Mommy! Daddy, help me! Anyone, please! Anyone save me!" I dropped the basket, sprinting to the window to see if anyone was down there. I was so scared to see no one outside that I lost all control of my body and started to scream until I raced downstairs. I asked around to see if anyone has heard such a thing, but no one has heard a little boy outside. I have seen things before, but never heard a voice or a spirit, whatever you want to call it. My mother, father, and 2 friends of theirs decided to have a double date at the forts, as they all lived in the same town at the time. It was springtime, and occasionally there were little events being held. After all, it's a very popular tourist site. As they sit down to have lunch, my mother spots what looks like a guard up in the old watchtower. He was wearing very old-fashioned combat clothes and gear. My mom points out to him to the group. They all automatically assume they must be hosting some kind of tour. It was all common for those giving tours to dress up like they were from the old days. None of them had ever seen the inside of the watchtower before, so they took a walk up to see what was going on. My mom has told me that she was excited to see the inside, but as they got closer and closer to the tower, she had an increasingly ominous feeling. My mom is watching the soldier in the tower pacing back and forth. At this point, they're at the top of the hill. They go around to the back of the tower to the entrance. This is where my mother says She felt all the blood literally drained from her face. There were several heavy-duty padlocked chains keeping the door shut. My father said, judging by the amount of rust, they had been there for at least 20 years. They circled back around to the front of the tower, and the soldier is gone. My mother said she will never forget that day as long as she lives. Especially the feeling she had as they approached the entrance of the watchtower. It was a Tuesday afternoon after a tough day at school. I went home and went straight to sleep. I woke up, and at least I thought I did, and there was a demon-like figure that stood at the end of my bed. It had a crooked back with scaly skin and long scrawny nails, long black matted hair with deep red eyes, like it had been awake for days upon days. I got out of bed and ran towards my door. As I reached my door, I looked back at my bed and saw something else, not just the demon. At the end of my bed, I saw myself sleeping. I was so confused I thought I was awake. The demon at the end of my bed was now walking towards me like a zombie, slow with its arms out ready to grab me. It was smiling at me, showing his or her black, stained, crooked teeth. I ran downstairs and out my front door. I seen a little girl at the end of my driveway crying. As I ran, she chased me, screaming my name louder and louder until poof, I was awake, sweating, crying, and shaking like a leaf. How could something like this happen? Was I asleep? Or is this something I should seriously worry about? I lived before in a 200 population village surrounded by a dense forest and mountains. The area isn't known for its paranormal activity, but I guess that's because we are a tight-knit community and we don't want strangers to come vandalize our homes and community places or invade the few empty houses in the village. The story didn't happen to me, but I have heard about it from many people who don't even believe in the supernatural in the first place. So I guess this is as legitimate as you can get. This will also be very short, as it was only one event that happened and nobody heard anything about it after that. The first person who told me about this story was my father. We have a huge age gap, so I like asking him questions about his life when he was younger, and he always has interesting and funny stories to tell. But this is no funny story. When he was in his 20s or 30s, he had a party at a very, very old house, built in the 1820s, with about 20 other people from the village. I think it was a thank you party for doing volunteer work. There were 2 floors, so the first floor and a basement. The owner had locked the door leading to the basement, so everybody was upstairs having a good time. They were all eating great food. Eventually, it became late, and soon enough, it was dark outside, and 10 p.m. rang on the owner's clock. Quickly enough, everybody fell silent, deadly silent, and there my father heard a chain clicking in the basement, as if someone was chained and walked around. Everybody heard it, as clearly as someone walking into your ear. They all felt extremely scared, as if the devil himself was in the owner's basement. It was such a dark fear coming from their very primitive instincts that nobody would move. They would all stare at the door leading to the basement. After a few minutes, the most courageous man in the house moved and headed towards the door leading to the basement. Jokingly, he said, "Don't worry, It's probably a rat messing with owner's chains. But I don't own chains. I work at the post office. The man reached for the door and put his hand on the handle and didn't turn it. Never did. My dad saw his face turn as white as the snow, and he's pretty sure that the guy pissed himself out of fear. That was the end of the party. Everybody went quickly back home, leaving the owner alone with whatever scary monster was in his basement. To this day, my dad has never felt again the fear he felt on that day. He can't even imagine what they could have seen if they went into the basement. But it would have been something extremely evil to bring them such fear. I first met the demon when I was 17, and on that night he saved my life. I was standing at the bus stop waiting to catch a ride from my after-school job. I had forgotten my umbrella that day, and as you know, it always rains when you forget your umbrella. It was coming down in freezing bucketfuls, and I was trying to ignore the fact that I was floating in my own shoes. Suddenly the rain above me stopped, and I looked up to see him, the demon, shielding me with his umbrella. He looked like a person put together by someone who didn't know what a human being looked like. He was long and lanky, 6.5 feet at least, and his shoulders were hunched forward, so that his profile resembled a giant vulture. His face was gaunt, all sharp edges and deep hollows, and across it was plastered a wide, friendly smile of crooked gray teeth.
"Haven't you heard, friend?"
he asked. "No," I said. "Heard what?" "The bus isn't coming today. The driver was drunk and got into a crash. Everybody on board was killed." The way he said the last part, cheerful, almost made my stomach turn. I wasn't sure if I really believed him, but I decided that I would leave anyway. I felt a strong urge to put as much distance between him and me as possible. "Oh," I replied, "I guess I'll have to walk it." "Yes, you will. Here, take my umbrella." He extended the umbrella out towards me, and without thinking, I accepted it. My fingers briefly brushed the skin of his hand, and a shiver shot through my entire body. The next day I saw the bus crash on the news, except it happened after my stop. Just as the man had said, everyone on board had died. And if it weren't for him, I would have been on board too. The next time I saw the demon was during my sophomore year of college. He was waiting for me in my dorm room, hunched over the desk and reading one of my books. "It's you," I said. "Yes," he replied. "It's me." He calmly shut the book and turned to face me, beaming his crooked-toothed grin. "I brought you a present," he said. My stomach squirmed. "You did?" I asked. "Oh, yes." He reached a hand inside the lapel of his jacket and retrieved a pink spiral notebook. The name Ellen Hartwell was printed on the cover. "This belongs to the pretty brunette in your psychology class," he said. "The one you're always staring at. You will tell her you found it, and then ask her out to dinner." He sat down on the desk. In that moment I blinked, and he disappeared. The final time I saw the demon was the night my son was conceived. My wife Ellen was waiting in the bedroom. While I took a quick shower, I stepped out naked and dripping wet to see the man standing in my bathroom. "Hello again, friend," he said. "You scared me," I replied. "I know. Listen to me. Tonight, you are going to talk to your wife. She is ready to have children, but she doesn't know it yet. She will conceive your son tonight." My heart swelled at the thought of a son, but my stomach was less optimistic, and it squirmed with uneasiness. "Why are you helping me?" I asked. The man smiled widely. "The strands of fate are long," he said. "Much longer than a single human life." He snapped his fingers and disappeared in a mist of blue-gray smoke. The man never visited again after that, but sometimes I would get the uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach that accompanied his presence. Years passed, then decades, and gradually I forgot about him until the day the police came. They came with bloodhounds and shovels, and they turned my entire property inside out. After all was said and done, they had found the remains of 37 women and arrested my only son. My son claimed throughout the trial that a demon had forced him to commit the murders, but the prosecution did not believe it, and he was sentenced to death. But I recognized the demon from the thousands of sketches that filled his notebooks. It was a gaunt-faced man with a wide, friendly smile of crooked, dead gray teeth.
The end is near. You have all heard it before. This time, I think it's real. I was kidnapped by Rick and Jerry a few months ago. I was walking down the street. They ran out of their house, down the driveway, and just grabbed me. If I'm honest, they pretty much look the same now as they did when they caught me. Crazed eyes, unwashed and unshaved, old tattered clothes, and a fear that hits your soul like a knife in the belly. I'm in their bunker, underground, and they summon the devil on a daily basis. The process takes half an hour or so depending on how much sleep they have had. If they don't summon him every day, he'll appear somewhere else on the planet and have his way. And believe me, having seen him in his bubble, I don't want to see him in the rest of the world. They have 7 glyphs that they draw on the ground. They have a different machine for each glyph, and once they adjust the dials, they switch them on. The first time they turned them on, they set all the dials to 0, and didn't know what wouldn't happen. They summoned the most abominable thing imaginable. They are telling me now that they think they might have created it. So what happens when they try to summon him? Normally I'm sitting nearby on the sofa. At the start, I used to try and leave the room. There are reasons why I don't anymore. Once they have set up the equipment, the 7 glyphs drawn in chalk on the floorboards, each in a different color, start to throb. They glow in the color before moving through the spectrum, getting bluer and bluer as the energy increases. They reach a point after a minute or two when they have all turned bright white, and you begin to see streaks with the spectrum refracted on the walls. It would be quite beautiful if it weren't so horrifying what was about to happen. After a while, a ball of light appears in the middle, hovering about a meter above the ground. Once it begins to grow, the rest of the process usually takes about 20 to 25 minutes. The light is the color of blood, not bright red, the dark stuff that oozes and crusts in horrible lumps. First you get to see 4 limbs growing out from the center. After this a head pushes out, then feet, fingers, eyes, tusks, hair. Once fully formed, it is nothing short of grotesque. Imagine the most horrific man you have ever seen. He is so hunched he stands at half his height. He's covered in boils and wields a trident of tarnished bronze. He lets his left arm hang with the back of his head dragging across the floor. He's naked and hairy. Thick, long hair sprouts sparsely across his back and over his head. His shoulders are so hunched you can't even see a neck. His face is the ugliest person imaginable, but the main feature is his tusks, or tusk, seeing as one is broken off. He's got an underbite, like a troll. He can't see anyone with anything other than hatred. Once he's up, they usually leave him for a few minutes to do his thing and take some measurements before they deactivate the equipment. He gets more powerful the longer he's left. The thing he does, even trapped in the small circle, you wouldn't imagine. He's fast for something so small. His uncomfortable rage is so bare and so horrifyingly honest, you can't look away, and I have never seen so much bile. Once he's gone, Rick and Jerry return to their work. I presume they're trying to find an alternative. At some point, without a doubt, something will fail, or break. Poor sods. They created the thing that will destroy the world, but that's not the whole puzzle. Harriet's down there too. She never leaves the room. She can tell the other two are embarrassed she's here, but they can't let her leave. If the truth gets out, the ritual will be destroyed. If the truth gets out, the ritual will be destroyed. She is free to go about as she wants. In here, though, I talked to her at the start, and I was starting to get to know her. But when I saw what Rick and Jerry were doing and tried to explain, she went vacant and started to ignore me, like she did with the others. I wish I could help her, but I don't know how. So what do I do during the day? I hang around because sooner or later they are going to need someone to take over the ritual. The larger two, in their late 60s, and by the looks of things, haven't got much life left in them. For now, I mostly do the shopping and read anything they have lying around. For now, you are safe. Be warned. It could happen at any time. One of them gets too ill to move, trips over and breaks an arm. The police investigation to find Harriet leads them to the front door. They run out of chalk, anything until then. This is us. This is our life. And we're doing it for you.
When I was 5 or 6 years old, I lived in a house that was haunted. Every night I would lay down to go to bed. I'd wake up around midnight and there would be this guy standing at the edge of my bed. He never did anything. He just always stared at me. It's as if he didn't even know I was there. The man appeared to be in his late 40s, early 50s, and wore a white suit and a white cowboy hat. I believe that he was some kind of rancher or country singer. I was always scared to move. I'd always just lay frozen in bed for hours until the sun came up. One day I was in my brother's room playing Mario Brothers on the NES, and I seen hundreds of eyes appear on the wall. They just stared, and the room temperature dropped by like 20 degrees, and I could hear whispering and breathing. I felt the presence of something evil behind me. I ran out of the room and onto the front porch. I was home, alone. My mother and father had left to go buy beer and cigarettes. When they got back, I told them what I had seen, and my father told me to quit acting fucking stupid before he knocked the hell out of me. My father was an asshole piece of shit. Later on that night, I was in my brother's room again, and then the power had went out due to a thunderstorm. As my mother and father sat in the living room, they saw something run past them. Then the light flickered. The lights came back on a few minutes later, and my mother swears that on the wall, written in blood, read the words, "Get out now or die." She shook her head in disbelief, and then the message was gone. The next night, while my parents were asleep, I lay awake as usual, scared of the cowboy in the white suit staring at me. I began to smell rotting flesh and sulfur. I heard the door creak open, and I saw the shadowy, demonic-looking creature with horns. It began creeping into the room, and for the first time ever, the cowboy guy shouted, "Leave!" As he pointed his finger at the foul, hellish creature. The demon looked at me for a few seconds, then turned and walked away. Several weeks later, we moved out of that creepy old house, and the next family that had moved into the house was a preacher, his wife, and newborn son. The preacher, his wife, and son were fine. I believe that the preacher deliberately burned the house down to get rid of whatever the hell was in that house. I have never experienced anything like that ever again. I believe that the cowboy from the haunted house was an angel or some shit. I don't know. I'm not religious. I'm pretty sure that God was protecting me and my family. So my bedroom is in the end of the bedroom hallway. So I tend to close my door at night. I do not want to give any sort of open invite to the man that lives in the hallway. I've had 2 encounters with him in my room. Other than that, it's always been the feeling of him chasing me down the hall. Mind you, I've lived in this house for 16 years. I am pretty much convinced something about the land my house is built on is haunted. Before this experience, I slept with my door open, so this particular night the door was open, since I am petrified of the dark. My parents kept 2 night lights on in the hallway, one directly outside my door, and the other on the opposite end of the hall. My room is set up like a square. The door is on the top right corner of the box, and my bed is on the bottom line of the box. If that makes sense, at the time, the side of my bed was pressed up against the wall, meaning when you are turned on one side, you are either faced towards my entire room, or you turn the other side and you're facing the wall. I lay with my back staring at the ceiling until I saw something move, a shadow that formed by the hallway light closet to my door, as someone would make walking past it. I looked over and I see it, standing against my doorway, the shadow of a tall man staring at me, except I only felt his stare, as he is a shadow with no detail. I look up at my ceiling and say the Lord's Prayer, as I was taught. I look back and it was gone. One night, I was unable to sleep. I was on my iPod, playing Angry Birds, when I felt unease. I was facing towards my wall already, and something told me not to turn around. I lay there, frozen. I heard a crack of the floorboards beneath my carpet, a sound that can only be made when walking slowly over a specific spot in the floor in front of my door. My back against whatever was walking towards me, I felt defenseless. I did what most kids do in movies. I pulled the covers over myself and shut my eyes tightly, still facing the wall. I felt it come closer. Then I had a feeling like it was directly watching over me, as a parent would crouch over their baby's crib and watch them sleep. I felt breathing on the back of my head. It felt like 20 hours had gone by before I finally crashed. Nowadays, I close my door every night when I sleep, and if I dare go to the bathroom on the opposite end of the hall, sure enough, I feel like I am being chased when I walk back to my room. When I was 5 years old, way back in 1994, I was having very vivid dreams that a young child should not even know of. Images of death, torture, and other terrible things. The nightmares finally ended about a week later, but I'll describe the preceding events. The dreams consisted of being chased around various hallways and massive rooms, each with different instruments of torture, always being followed by the same creature, a large stick-like creature with long jagged fingers that floated more than walked, and to top it off had a mask. I was seeing various people I have not recalled meeting, all being tortured in different ways in front of me. Every time I would stop to help, the masked creature would catch up and impale me more and more. This was not a dream I could wake up from. Upon running for what felt like forever, I was finally pinned against a wall, where I was forced to face the creature. He grabbed me, lifted me, and before I knew it, I was awake. I remember looking around the room, terrified of what had happened. As I was calming down, I could see in the ceiling what appeared to be a mask, looking at me. I screamed immediately, recognizing what had followed me. My mom heard the scream and rushed to my room and turned on the lights and asked me what was wrong. I told her about my dream and what I had saw on the ceiling. Afterwards, to help me calm down, my mom told me she would run a bath, as it always calmed me down. After I stripped down, there was all kinds of cuts and scrapes on my body. The doctor prescribed it as something caused by night terrors, me scratching myself. As for some small pinholes and bites, he suggested a new bed, as he felt that there may be bed bugs. We moved from that house and haven't had an issue since. It sounds weird because it is weird. Let me start off by saying that there were no drugs or alcohol involved during this time of my life. I was 15 or 16. It was during the summer because I was home on a weekend, sitting on the couch watching Days of Our Lives. The couch was on a wall by a window, and to see the TV, you had to angle your head to the left, and to the right was the doorway into the kitchen with a full view of the kitchen. So it's the middle of the day, and I am sitting on the couch watching TV. And have you ever just realized that there is a noise, and that it has been making noise for a minute, but you are just now noticing it? Well, I realized that I was hearing what sounded like a man doing a really bad impression of a cat meowing over and over, and it was coming from my right side. I looked over, and in the middle of the kitchen beside the table was a shadowy person. It was solid. I could see the buttons on the long coat it was wearing, and it had a hat, but the face was just the shadow and a blur, and it did not have any feet or legs. The jacket just hovered about a foot above the ground. I jumped up, and when I did, it turned to the right and ran toward the back door and disappeared. No noise, and no feet, but the arms and jacket moved like it was running, and it was gone. I hid in the bathroom for about 30 minutes after that, terrified it was going to reappear somewhere. But that was it. Never saw anything like it again.
I was driving home from work and stopped by McDonald's to treat myself after my PT test. I had to drive extremely far from my house to find an open McDonald's, and when I finally found one, I was 30 minutes from my home. After getting my food, I started driving home. The entire way home, I felt an extreme existential dread, like something was off about the road I was on, and I felt like I was alone and would never see my wife again. I was on a stretch of highway with trees on both sides and 0 cars passing. After about 10 minutes of driving with no other cars, I saw a stoplight. The light was green, and then there was a deer standing under the light. It had been raining, and the puddle under the deer made it look like its legs had another joint where its feet should be, and that it was around a foot taller than it should have been. When I drove up on it, I realized it wasn't the reflection. I went to drive around it, and as soon as my front bumper got past the deer, my radio blasted static at max volume. I turned the radio off and floored it. When I turned around, the deer had been previously facing to the right, was facing my car, staring at it. I went 20 over the speed limit on the way home, cutting through privatized housing, sped up over all the speed bumps in my complex to get inside. By far the scariest thing that's happened to me. But I'm not too scared anymore, considering I haven't heard of skinwalkers following people home. When I was about 12 years old, I was driving with my dad on a road from Widow Rock, Arizona, toward I-40 Junction near Sanders, Arizona, and this road is located on the Navajo Nation. All the reservation is trees and high desert, and houses aren't found for miles, and there isn't any electricity or running water. My dad and I were driving south, and it was snowing, and it was about 2 a.m. We were driving for about 40 minutes from Widow Rock, and my dad and I saw a woman beside the road with no shoes and no jacket. When we saw her, she was walking about 25 feet from the road. She did not even look back to see who it is, and even try to hitchhike. She just kept on walking like nothing was wrong. Then my dad says, "Damn, she must be freezing." I started laughing because I thought she was drunk or something, walking in the middle of nowhere in the middle of the night. Then my dad pulled over for her, and she was still walking, so my dad shouted in Navajo and in English, "Hey, do you want to ride?" As soon as my dad yelled, she turned around slowly to look at us, and her long hair was covering her face. We could not even see what her face looked like. Her hair covered her whole head like a mop head. She slowly started walking towards us, stepping on rocks and branches and snow. She walked up to the truck on the passenger side where I was sitting and just stood by the window. My dad said, "Open the door, jump in the back." As soon as I opened the door, she took off, running away in the dark forest. My dad and I were stunned because it was freezing out there, and there wasn't civilization for miles. So I just closed the door, and my dad closed the door. We just took off and thought, what the hell is her problem? Because she looked like a regular person. A couple of weeks later, my dad was visiting some of his friends who lived within 5 miles of the area, and my dad just mentioned what happened to them, and their faces just looked stunned. And they said, was her hair covering her whole head and had no shoes? My dad said, yeah. Then they said, it wasn't a real lady, she's a ghost. My dad and I were like, what? She looked like a real person. My dad's friends weren't surprised because the Navajos are used to hearing weird stories like that. It was the 23rd of December, 2018. I was in Payson, Arizona, a bit north of Phoenix. My friends and I, in our Christmas spirit, decided to head out north of town, about 5 to 6 miles or so, into the forest on a secluded trail. It was cold that night. Some of my friends shivered and displayed obvious signs of unpreparedness. I was layered fairly well, and yet the winds and frigid cold punctured through my layers and onto me. We wanted to make a bonfire, warm up, enjoy ourselves, and have a few drinks. I knew as soon as I got into the car to head that way, something was off. I felt sick, uneasy, and something in my gut told me to just stay home. But I couldn't put my finger on just what, and I ignored my ever so looming feelings of anxiety. We picked up friends and headed to the trail. I'm a huge nature lover and always felt safe in the confines of the forest. I felt in control, at ease, but not tonight. It may sound cliche, but I'll be damned if it didn't feel like someone or something was watching me. When we finally got there, and when I had gotten far enough down the trail that turning back would be no hasty endeavor, it finally hit me why I felt so eerie. That same year, during the weeks prior to Thanksgiving. I was here before. It's not a spot we usually go to, therefore I was not familiar with it. Nor were my friends. We were coming out for the same reason we were in December, for a few drinks around a bonfire. It was late. I, however, had not had any spirits that night. It was my job to gather firewood. I didn't mind. My chance to survey and explore the area around us wouldn't be bad. Before I even left our area, things took a turn for the strange. I was at the edge of the light being cast from the small bonfire I was to gather more fuel for. In the faint glow of the far trees, I caught a glimpse of something dark behind the tall pine. I asked backwards to my friends if it was out of the ordinary for people to be hanging around the spot. My query was only met with silence from them as they drank on. I took a few more steps beyond the comfort of the blaze, keeping my eyes affixed to the tall, shadowy figure fixated behind the tall trees. I could faintly make out that it had moved in a slight bobbling motion, like a buoy upon a tide. My immediate thoughts drew a blank as to why someone would be out here doing this. Maybe I was seeing things, or it was a prank of some sort. I opened my mouth to call out or even crack a joke, but I was mortified when I realized I could not speak. Something inside me prevented me from any noise. My heart raced. As it swiftly came, it shot off into the distance like a bullet. Being startled so badly, I fell back on to the ground and kicked myself back like a spooked animal, scratching and cutting my hands as I did so. My friend saw me and laughed, thinking I was drunk. I managed to stammer out a line to what I saw, but I was only met with a few blank stares and laughs, making me sound stupid. For the rest of the night, I never dared step away from the beams of the bonfire. As I walked down the trail that frigid December evening, I remember what I had seen and felt on that cold November night, and my stomach dropped. My friends were slurring out Christmas carols and other drunk epiphanies. I knew they wouldn't listen to me even if I spoke out, so I ignored the guttural feelings, prayed for the best, and walked on. I had not been drinking much this night either. I don't enjoy alcohol as much as my friends, and often I was the one responsible for herding them home when the night was over. However, to calm my tense nerves, I had a drink or two from some Jaeger we had chilled in the ice chest. It was Christmas after all. We were all having a good time, enjoying our festive feelings and generally saving the crisp forest atmosphere. Soon nature called, and forgetting my prior ordeal, I began to walk away from the fire to relieve myself. I walked a fair 300 or so feet away towards a big rock resting behind some fallen trees, not wanting to be seen doing my business. I was not even far enough away from the fire to not be able to hear my friends' voices echoing through the woodlands. From behind me, my friend Corbin, who had come along, called out my name. I'll admit I was tipsy, but nowhere near enough to not differentiate reality from a drunken stupor. I remember calling out to him, telling him to give me a minute to finish. I zipped up and turned to walk around the rock to where I heard him wander to. I don't know what it was, but sure as all heaven above and hell below is not Corbin. It took me a minute for my woozy mind to put this together and stop walking towards it. I am thankful I did. This being stood tall, at least 6 to 7 feet. Its eyes burned like our fire. It moved from a dog-like four-limb position to standing tall. The light from the moon on this cold night radiated the body, showing off its dark, slender shape with an inhuman sheen. I began to sob violently My mind ran in panicked circles. Seconds felt like lifetimes as my world ground to a halt at the clawed feet of the beast that I was sure was going to take my life from me right then and there. I did the only thing I could think to do. I dropped to my knees and began to pray. This monster, to my petrified brain, had to have been the devil himself. To imagine him anything worse than it would be impossible. It did not like my pleas to God, an unholy shriek of what I can only think to describe as someone screaming loudly with lungs full of water rang out. I screamed in terror, and with all the strength I could muster, lunged backwards across the forest floor, running as fast as my legs could take me. I fell a few times, I think, in sheer panic. I just could not manage to get my body to work properly, knowing that this thing was near. When I returned in a panicked craze to the fire, covered in sweat, dirt, and tears, I managed to wheeze out what happened somewhat through my sobs of fear. I could tell they doubted whether or not I was desperately stammering out of what was real or not. I think I was so horrified in that moment that I had a small seizure, because everything else is a blur. I remember going to the truck, leaving. I remember waking up the next day receiving a multitude of texts saying I was either stupid or crazy, or texts from worried friends asking if I was okay. And I also remember the last I saw of the thing before I met my frenzied flea. When it smiled back at me through the forest and skittered off into the darkness a few days after Christmas, I was able to get in touch with a native elder here in town. I was so scared mentioning the event because I was worried of being mocked or him not believing in me. To a twist of my thinking, I told him very vividly I had encountered. He wholeheartedly believed, and he told me it was a skinwalker. He then blessed me thoroughly and told me to leave that stretch of land alone and to never venture out there again. Next time I might not be so lucky. He did not have to tell me twice. I know, I sound crazy. If I were you, I wouldn't believe me either. But you don't have to. All you have to know is, for the love of God above and all things holy, never forget that we are not alone on this earth. Sometimes during the night, whenever I look out my window, I catch sight of eyes in the trees, looking back at me.